Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm bringing you guys a brand new track review segment where I get to cover several new track releases. If you haven't seen my last track review video, this is a newer thing I'm starting on my channel this year, where as opposed to reviewing a single track in a video, I'm going to be trying to cover multiple tracks in every video just so I can talk about more new songs and things of that sort. That's pretty much what's going to be going on the channel if you didn't see that last video. But today we have several new songs that I want to talk about, several new singles that have been released so far in 2018. So yeah, with that said, let's just get into talking about them pretty much. The first single that we're going to be talking about here today is this new track from Logic, Keanu Reeves. Now when it comes to Logic in his music, I would consider myself someone who definitely thinks Logic has a lot of talent and the ability to make a great project, but in recent years I haven't really been super impressed with a lot of Logic's output. If you see my reviews of any of his more recent output, I haven't exactly been crazy about them, but I don't exactly hate them either. I'm most of the time really middle of the road with them, and this new single here from him is one that really just doesn't interest me at the end of the day. It's really just Logic doing his more trap-focused sound and creating a pretty straightforward trap banger, if you will, but it's one that's not really all too interesting, and there's not all too much to this track that's really worth remembering or coming back to. The beat to this track is probably the strongest aspect of it. It's actually pretty decent overall. However, it's not outstanding or out of this world or anything, and the fact that the rest of the track isn't really all that great, the beat doesn't save it, pretty much, is what I'm trying to get at. Logic's rapping on the track is also pretty decent as well, but once again, it's pretty standard Logic fare. I mean, he's rapped better before, and he's rapped worse as well, but yeah, it's just really middle of the road, I guess. It's the lyrics on this cut that are really the weak point of the track overall. There's a lot of really bad moments on this thing lyrically. Like, there's a part in the lyrics here where he references Fortnite, and he's talking about, again, being biracial here, though he's really self-aware of it once again here. Though it's all stuff that I've heard him done before. He's talked about being biracial before, both seriously and in a more comedic, self-aware kind of way. This track really just doesn't offer anything new in terms of its lyrics, and it's just pretty uninteresting at the end of the day. And the cringy bars that occasionally sneak their way in there as well really don't help things. Overall, this track is just really uninteresting, and it really does prove my point that Logic, I think, needs to really take a break from releasing projects so frequently, because I feel like everything at this point is just starting to blur together. Between the two projects he dropped last year and probably the new one that's going to be right around the corner, I just feel like I'm kind of sick of Logic at this point, which, given that, with his most recent output, I haven't liked it really, but I haven't hated it either. I don't really feel like that should be the case. I haven't disliked any of his more recent output enough to really feel sick of him at this point, unless he was, releasing a ton of projects, which he really has done in recent times. So yeah, this track really doesn't have all too much to it that's all too interesting. I guess this is one for the more hardcore Logic fans, but they probably don't need me to tell them to listen to this track. In fact, they probably have already listened to this song. So yeah, I would avoid it unless you're in that Logic hardcore fan base. Next up, the next song I want to talk about is this new track from Paul McCartney, Get Enough. Now, when it comes to Paul McCartney, I'm not familiar with every nook and cranny of his career. I am familiar with a lot of his stuff that he did with the Beatles, of course, and some aspects of his career that he's done since the Beatles, solo career, things like that. However, I didn't get around to checking out his last studio album that came out last year. It was on my list of albums to potentially get throughout the year, but I just never got around to doing so. I do apologize for that. But he did drop this new single this year, so I decided to check it out, and oh boy, is it an interesting one to say the least. Get Enough sees Paul McCartney playing around with some sounds that aren't too different from what you would expect from him, but he's also taking some steps in some really strange and different directions as well, most notably using a lot of auto-tune here in this track on his voice. Now, I'm not somebody who hates auto-tune or vocal manipulations or anything like that right off the bat. I think that they have a time and place where they can work and sound nice in music. However, my two general rules for it has to be that the first of those being that it has to be applied in a creative, interesting sort of way, not just there to kind of hide the lack of talent of the singer, and the second of those two things has to be that it has to sound good with how it's incorporated into the song. Now, I would definitely say that it's incorporated into this track in a way that's intended to be creative and different. He's not applying it here in this song to mask his voice not sounding good or anything like that. It's applied so heavily here on this track that he's clearly trying to make it obvious to the listener what exactly he's doing. However, I don't really feel like he does a whole ton interesting with it outside of the fact that it's obviously intended to be used for creative purposes. He's trying to do something creative with it, but nothing all too interesting comes as a result of what he does here on this song itself. What you end up getting on this track are some awkward mixes of Paul's more normal singing voice, which sounds, rather aged as you would expect it to be given how old the guy is at this point. But then you also have moments where he comes in really auto-tuned, and because of the auto-tuned, he doesn't sound quite as old as he actually does when he's singing. It makes him sound somewhat younger, I guess you could say. And it's just really weird to listen to. It's almost like he's singing with himself, but like a younger version of himself that's like severely auto-tuned too. It's really odd overall. I'm not sure how else to really describe it. But he doesn't really do all too much creative with it, really. He just uses a lot of the auto-tune to kind of like stand out here on this track, because I feel like without the auto-tune here, there's not all too much super interesting to this track. There is a somewhat interesting build-up throughout the song, and the instrumentation here is pretty solid overall. However, it's not really, it doesn't really knock anything out of the park. It's not all too crazy or special or outstanding. It's just pretty standard overall. I feel like without the auto-tune, this would be a pretty unmemorable track. I just kind of feel like the auto-tune is there to give it something to stand out with, because there's not all too much in the bass track alone. Now, I think the auto-tune itself doesn't sound particularly terrible, like in terms of how it just sounds on the ears. It's not particularly grating or anything like that. But it just does feel somewhat strange with how it's incorporated here into this track. Overall, yeah, I kind of had mixed opinions on this song. I definitely feel like it's a really interesting track in some regards. I'm not sure if Paul's ever experimented with auto-tune before, or at least with all the material I've heard from him, he hasn't done so. But like I said, I'm not familiar with every single piece of music he's ever released, so maybe there is some song out there where he has done this before. But yeah, this is a pretty strange and interesting one overall. One that, if it sounds interesting to you, I highly recommend you listen to it, at least when it's not a particularly long song, so I don't really feel like you'll lose all too much from it. But yeah, I don't think it's a particularly good song or a bad one either. I'm like really middle of the road on this track, not because it's like boring or anything, but because it's such a strange track. It's almost like a song that's really entertaining to listen to, but not because I'm like enjoying it necessarily. I don't know, it's an odd song overall. That's the easiest way to describe it. But yeah, there's really not much else I feel like I could say on this one. Alright, the next three songs I have to talk about are a bit different than your typical tracks for one reason or another. I will explain why as I talk about each of them, but I do want to get that out of the way first, that my explaining for these tracks may not be as detailed as the two I've mentioned previously, just for that reason. The first of these three tracks I have to talk about is this new Charlemagne's Menagerie track, Pick Your Poison. Charlemagne's Menagerie being the musical project of fellow music YouTuber Viral Rack. Check out his channel if you haven't done so, as well as his debut album that dropped last year. It was a pretty great album overall. But this new track isn't really a brand new track, if you will. I believe it was a older track from several years ago, kind of redone and reworked. It's kind of like a scrap demo type track, if you will. And it's a pretty short one as well. It's mostly just one pretty long rap verse. And overall, it's a pretty interesting listen for someone who was a fan of that debut album that came out last year. I think that the flow here on this track is one that's pretty solid. I like the really fast flow that going on here. And I like a lot of the lyrics that do pop up on this thing as well. I think they're pretty solid overall. And the beat, for what it's worth, is also pretty solid too. If I do have any complaints with this track, though, I would say that the mixing here, when it comes to the vocals and the instrumentation, isn't quite as nice as it could be. Sometimes it's a bit difficult to make out what's going on when it comes to the vocals and what's being said. And also the track is, at the end of the day, a really short one. It's only like a minute and a half long, and it's just one pretty long verse. It's clearly meant to be more of a, just a side scrapped track than a full-length track that would appear on an album or something like that. And in that regard, this track is definitely going to appeal more to people who like that debut album that came out last year, as opposed to maybe newcomers or people like that. So yeah, I would definitely recommend this track more to the people who like that debut album from last year or any of the EPs that came out before that. If you're new to this musical project, I highly recommend you check out that debut album, No Signal, that came out last year, and then maybe check out this new kind of scrapped, reworked demo track. But it is a pretty solid listen overall for what it's worth. So yeah, not a bad track by any means. The next track I want to talk about is a remix song. It is the Don Diablo remix of the Panic at the Disco track High Hopes that came out on their album last year, Pray for the Wicked. A track that overall in its original state wasn't one that I was particularly crazy about. I don't think it was one of my least favorites from Pray for the Wicked. I mean, I don't remember much of the album, to be completely honest, because it didn't really stand out to me all that much. But this track overall is one that I've heard a lot since then, just because it did become a really popular song. And it's one that I'm not particularly crazy about. I mean, I don't hate the song, but I don't really like it either, if you will. And this new remix here isn't one that I really feel does the track any big favors. It's just a pretty generic remix at the end of the day. It doesn't really take the track and do anything all too interesting with it. I feel like a lot of your enjoyment of this remix is going to be based on whether or not you actually enjoyed the bass track that was on Pray for the Wicked. If you like High Hopes, maybe you'll like this remix of it because, you know, it's just more High Hopes pretty much. But if you weren't a fan of High Hopes, you're definitely not going to like this remix. And even if you are a fan of the track, you still might find this remix here to be a pretty uninteresting one overall. It really just does not do a whole lot with the bass track. And like I said, the bass track wasn't one that was particularly interesting to begin with. So yeah, not a track I particularly care for at the end of the day. One that I will definitely slip out of my mind within the upcoming days or weeks. And the final track that we're going to be talking about here today is actually a newer version of the Imagine Dragons song Believer, only this version of the track features Lil Wayne providing a verse here. Now this was one that kind of surprised me in some regards, because Believer, the original track, while it was one of Imagine Dragons' most popular cuts, it was a track that came out from their 2017 album Evolve, which is kind of odd considering that they just dropped an album last year in November. So it's really weird that they're doing a newer version of a track from an album that's older than their newest one, instead of maybe doing a newer version of one of the tracks from that album, you know, like a remix or a verse from Lil Wayne being added to it, something like that. I feel like that's what would make the most sense, honestly, to try to get some more hype for that new album instead of the older one. But, you know, whatever, really. I mean, I didn't like either of those albums anyway, so it really doesn't make much of a difference. Believer in its bass format wasn't a track that I cared for at all. In fact, it was probably one of my least favorites from Evolve. And this new version here, it's the only difference here is that the second verse is replaced by a Lil Wayne verse. And the verse from Lil Wayne is actually one that's not all too terrible, honestly. Lyrically, it's not one that's super exciting or anything like that, but his flow on the verse is actually pretty solid overall. It's not one that really blew me away or anything, but for what it's worth, it was okay. I just kind of wish the beat that he was rapping over was more interesting, because he's really just rapping over the track's instrumental, which is a pretty uninteresting instrumental, pretty much. So yeah, the verse that he spits here on this track definitely improves the bass song, but not to the point of me liking the song overall, because you know, outside of that one verse that he provides, the rest of the track is unchanged pretty much, and it's not a pleasant listen. So yeah, don't listen to this unless you're like a big Imagine Dragons fan or something. If you're like a big Lil Wayne fan and you want to hear this, just listen to his verse by itself. I mean, you're not going to get anything else from the rest of this track, really. And even still, his verse here, while it's one that is definitely more enjoyable than the rest of the track and what it has to offer, it's not stellar or anything either. It really didn't blow me away or anything. It's just better than the rest of the track, really. So yeah, I'm not really sure why this track was released. It's just kind of odd to me, but it did happen, and now here we are talking about it. And with that said, that concludes the track reviews that I wanted to cover here in this segment. As I said before, this is hopefully the track review format that I'm most likely going to be doing from here on out, unless there happens to be a particular track that really catches my attention that I want to talk about by itself in a video. For the most part, I'll probably be doing videos like this instead, as it gives me a chance to talk about more songs and even some tracks that I definitely wouldn't have a chance to cover in a video by itself, like the last 3 tracks I talked about here in this video. Songs that I really don't feel like I have enough to say about in a video of their own, but in a format like this, I could talk about them pretty easily. So that's why I'm doing this newer format for the track reviews, and I think it's going to work out rather nicely. I'm not sure if this is going to be like a weekly series or maybe every other week or something like that, but yeah, hopefully in the future that this will be a somewhat regular series. With that said, thank you guys for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like on it and subscribe to the channel. Leave your own thoughts on these tracks in the comment section down below. These were just my own personal thoughts. If you happen to disagree, that's perfectly fine. Thank you for watching once again, and stay golden.